I'm saying is my sister's boyfriend got some beer and he's saying that if we pay him for it, we can have it.
Hold on a second. Why are you even talking about this? We're all underage and we shouldn't be drinking.
If you don't want to drink, you don't have to, Carter, but don't be a snitch.
Oh, okay.
Wait. What is the best thing to do in this situation? A. Call the cops. B. Set clear boundaries with your friend about what you're comfortable with. Set a plan before drinking. C. Yell at your friends.
Welcome back to Interview with an Expert. Today I'm here with prevention specialist Julie Goldberg, who is a licensed addiction counselor, and she works in Denver Public Schools.
Hey, nice to be here.
So to get started, what got you interested in prevention work?
So I moved to Colorado to go to grad school at Naropa for counseling, and while I was in school I was working at a detox center for drugs and alcohol. Naropa is a Buddhist school and it's wonderful for counseling, but it's like one part of the world, so I wanted more real world experience. So I was working in the detox where people would go to get off of drugs and alcohol, go through withdrawal, try to get sober support, and it was really intense. I continued to work in addictions throughout grad school, which was 3 years, but I started to work for public health in Boulder County and do prevention work there. I just kind of followed my supervisor and loved it. It was so much more fulfilling for me to see people before the addiction occurs. Detox is like, if there's a spectrum of addiction, the end of addiction, and prevention work is trying to stop any of that from happening. So I loved that work because it was preventative and it felt like I was making a larger impact.
So like on that, how does drug, alcohol, or any other substance addiction like show up, and why does it usually occur?
I don't think I can answer in like, this is why addiction occurs. I think if someone was able to answer that, they'd be super successful, probably win the Nobel Peace Prize. In my experience, addiction and trauma go hand in hand. So often people that have problematic substance use have experienced some trauma, whether it be like repeated trauma or one-time incident, but things that happen that impact their lives, and then substances help them cope. And everyone needs ways to cope with like tough things. Like going through the world as a human is hard. Some people have just found drugs or alcohol to help with that problem.
So in the case of teens, let's say there is substance use with either drugs and it leads to the point of an overdose, or alcohol where it leads to the point of alcohol poisoning. What are the symptoms of that, and how can teens assist a friend who might be going through that type of incident?
So an overdose is really scary, and a teen, I wouldn't even say like look for symptoms or like check for certain things. Like the number one thing that I try to tell teenagers is about the Good Samaritan law. So the Good Samaritan law, if someone is in need of medical attention and they've been consuming substances, you as the person that calls are protected, as are they, from any sort of legal repercussions, because you're calling out of good faith. So if they need medical attention, you'll be protected. So that's the number one thing. Like, don't try to be an expert on your own as a teenager. As an addiction counselor, I wouldn't feel competent to like know what to do. I would seek out medical attention. So always call for medical help and know that you're protected by the Good Samaritan law. If someone's throwing up and unconscious, definitely call, because they could choke on their own vomit. You want to make sure they're on their side while you're waiting for medical attention, and don't leave them alone. Make sure to stay with them. If someone's consumed Xanax and alcohol, that can be really, really dangerous. So like if they're passed out and you can't wake them up, they definitely need medical attention. So if someone's unconscious, which means like they're breathing but you can't wake them up, or their breath is really, really slow, long periods of breath, call for medical attention. If someone's consumed any sort of opiate and they're like slumped over, that's another sign, and blue in the face. But like number one thing, don't be an expert, call for medical help.
Yes. Yeah. So that's great learning about the Good Samaritan law, because I know a lot of teens might be scared, especially if they haven't been consuming anything, and you know, it's scary to think about like law enforcement or medical professionals being involved. Which on that, in the case that teens start consuming drugs, there's always this fear, stigma of like gateway drugs. Is that a true thing, or is that something more made to scare people out of taking certain drugs?
So the way I think about gateway drugs is that when you use drugs as a young person, your brain isn't fully developed. And the last part of your brain is the prefrontal cortex, which is the big picture rational decision making. So if this part of your brain right here isn't fully developed, you're not going to have decision-making skills to say no to other types of drugs. As an adult, you might have the brain functioning of a 16-year-old. And so your like long-term big picture decision-making, which would allow you to say no to heroin, isn't fully there. So that's one way I think of it, like gateway drugs. Also, like tolerance is a real thing. So if you're using weed every single day and you're smoking joints, that's a lower THC content than dabbing. So if you're continuing to use joints and then you go to dabbing and then your tolerance just increases and increases, like eventually you're going to need a bigger high. And that could lead to other drug use. But really, I think it impacts your decision making and your ability to, I know it's so corny, but like to say no. And know why.
Yeah. So when teens are using drugs, alcohol, nicotine, any type of substance, what should they be aware of in their surroundings and what they're using, you know, the situations that they're using in?
So my role is not to tell teens not to do drugs. That's not it. Like, my role is to provide information so teenagers can make informed decisions.
Yes.
So, depends on what substance. I would say like never consume in a public place. Just because weed is legal out here, that doesn't mean that you can use it in a public place. Same with alcohol. Don't use by yourself. Use among friends that you trust. Know what you're consuming. If you're going to choose to use psychedelics, get them tested before you're using them so they're not laced with anything. Same goes with weed, like know where you're getting it from so you know exactly what you're consuming. Try to use lower THC if possible and higher CBD. CBD doesn't affect your brain. Don't do stupid things because you're probably going to get caught. So when you get marijuana from a dispensary, on the box or whatever it comes in, it always says the THC count and it says the CBD count. So that's really important to know the content of THC and what you're consuming, and because we live in a state where it's legal, you have the ability to do that. Obviously, as a young person, you can't go to a dispensary and do that, but if you do have the option in some way, shape, or form, that's a really good way to know what you're consuming. Test kits, they're a little tricky to find on the internet. You have to do some digging, but just because you're ordering one off the internet doesn't mean you're going to be flagged with anything. And it's a really good way to safely consume substances.
Where can teens find resources in the form of counseling, websites, etc., to learn about substance abuse, drug usage, all of that?
So in Denver, it's actually a huge problem for adolescent substance use. There's not many service providers. Sandstone Care is an inpatient treatment center. They also have after-school programming. Actually, I think it's mixed now. Some are inpatient, some are after school, so you would go to school and then go there and get counseling. But that's a good place if someone has a serious addiction to go for support. My role with Denver Public Schools, there's about like 25 of us. So at different schools, there's prevention specialists that meet with kids that might have problematic use. Denver Health also offers a program. It's called the STEP program with counseling for substance use. I would strongly recommend trying to find an AA community, whether it be NA, AA, HA. Having sober support and community and connection is so important when someone's trying to stay sober or get help with substances. So as a teenager, if you know a friend that's struggling, offering to spend time with them without any drugs or alcohol is hugely impactful. Just creating that sense of connection and community.
And for our viewers who might not know, can you define like the different AA, NA, HA?
Yeah. AA is Alcoholics Anonymous. It's not only for alcoholics, but there are other groups that are substance specific. So say if someone has a problem with heroin, there's groups for people with heroin addiction. There's people, NA is Narcotics Anonymous. I'm trying to think, they have like Overeaters Anonymous, Love Addiction Anonymous, pretty much like anything that people might be struggling with and the behavior manifests like some sort of addictive behavior, they have groups for that.
Nice. So before we wrap up, is there anything else that you don't think we covered in the interview, or you just like to say to teens about substance use and drug usage and alcohol usage?
I think for me there's two things that I'd like to talk about. One, the first thing that comes to mind is something I share in my work with everyone as a prevention specialist. Like, actually most teenagers aren't consuming substances. Most teenagers aren't drinking, most of them aren't smoking nicotine or weed, but sometimes they can feel like that because our minds are like primed to catch people in the act or pay attention to when people are talking about it. But the reality is that most people aren't doing it. And if you train your mind to listen for those conversations, you'll notice that that's happening a lot more than those that are talking about substances all the time. Sometimes it can feel like everyone's doing it, but statistics show that that's not the case. It's actually the opposite. One thing that's a huge problem is juuling, or like fixes or Sorens, whatever you want to use, some sort of e-cigarette device. And I don't think it's the fault of the teens for using them. Teens were marketed to. So what was happening is cigarette smokers literally are dying. And then most of them started before the age of 18. So 88% of cigarette smokers started before the age of 18. Wow. So what do cigarette companies need to do to maintain their business? Advertise. So they advertise to young people, even though they said that that's not what they're doing, and they were advertising to people that were smokers and trying to quit. They also made ads that like marketed to young people. I don't know if it's the Juul, but it's something like the Juul that has the girl from Parkland with the shaved head.
Yes. During
During the time where she was in the media a ton, they found someone that looked just like her. So it's not her, but it looks just like her, and looks all cool and powerful, and then has a Juul in her hand. And that's just one example of how they're marketing to kids.
Yes.
They're marketing, these companies, to adolescents, making it look like this sophisticated, risk-free substance, and e-cigarettes have the same exact chemicals as cigarettes. A Juul has somewhere between 20 to 40 cigarettes in it in one pod. Fix and Sorens have 40 to 70. Some of them even have 90, the equivalents of 90 cigarettes. So people were marketed to and made to believe that it was a healthy alternative. There's nothing wrong with a teenager for wanting to use it.
Yes.
That's why people get addicted to it. It's the most addictive substance there is. It's harder to quit than heroin. So it's a huge public health issue right now, and there's not enough information coming out to teens. I mean, right now there's a ton in the news about like, oh, all these diseases and people dying, but still there's not information. It's also new and happening so fast. But what we do know is that it's literally the same as smoking a cigarette, if not worse.
Thank you so much, Julie, for coming and sitting down. I know that addiction is not an easy topic to bring up, and I think it's important that teens know the different risks of what they're doing, but also how to like seek help and access resources, because they're not always given. So thank you for being a part of the community that is providing those resources. Thank you for talking to our audience about them.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think it can feel really lonely for anyone, but especially teenagers when they're struggling with substance use. But just know that it's common, and there's resources, and there's people that want to help. And reaching out for help can be really, really scary, and is a brave thing to do.